If you're new to using a mitre saw or you recognise that you've got a lot left to learn, then you are in the right place. Today I'm going to be covering some of the most common mistakes new woodworkers make when using a mitre saw. Let's get into it. First up, a lovely habit to get into is using a stop block. If you have ever tried to make repetitive cuts, you may have been in the habit of grabbing a tape measure, putting it up against the piece of timber that you'll want to cut, marking it out, and then going to make your cut. And whilst that's well and good, if you find yourself needing to make the same length cut more than once, then you would be much better off using a stop block. And this is really simple. All you need to do is get yourself the piece of wood that you've made on your first cut, and using the quick clamp that comes on a lot of these mitre saws, just grab a piece of wood and push that down into place. Once you're happy with the positioning and you know that the piece of wood that you put up against this is going to give you that perfect length cut, you can then tighten up the clamp to make sure that that isn't going to move anywhere. Now you can push your piece of timber up against your stop block, and every cut that you make is guaranteed to be exactly the same length. Just like that. Next up, we've got rushing your cut. Now, when you first fire up your mitre saw, there is going to be a brief period where your blade has gone from not moving to spinning at a very, very fast RPM. And you do always want to make sure that you wait those very few nanoseconds to allow your blade to reach its full speed before you plunge it down into your piece of timber. Failure to do this will mean that your blade is not going at full speed, which will cause catching on your piece of wood and likely lead to unnecessary tear out. This is a brand new blade, and you can see what happens when I very quickly rush it down without waiting for the blade to reach its full speed, versus what happens if I allow it to reach its full speed first. And you can see that I'm left with a much nicer cut there. So whenever you go to make a cut, just be that little bit more patient and make sure that your blade has achieved full speed before plunging it down. Next, we have not using a sacrificial fence when cutting small pieces of timber. You'll know you've done this before if you've gone to cut a small piece of timber and sent it flying into the next postcode. And this is something that can be easily remedied by whipping yourself up a sacrificial fence. All you're going to need is a little bit of plywood like I've got here. You're going to want to cut it down on a table saw or a track saw if you have one to hand, and then simply screw the back part to the base. And there you have it, one incredibly basic sacrificial fence. Now you can make those cuts on smaller pieces of wood with a very good indication of where you're about to make a cut, but most importantly, it will stop those small pieces flying a million miles away. This also happens to double up as a great zero clearance insert for your mitre saw as well, which will prevent any really small pieces falling down that larger crack that usually comes in many of the mitre saws. And considering all you need is one piece of plywood to make this, I highly recommend giving it a go. Something you're probably very aware of is how heavy and awkward mitre saws are to carry around. And whilst most mitre saws do come with carry handles on the top, which allow you to lug them around like a suitcase, I would actually recommend that instead you get into the habit of always carrying it from the base. It's easier on your back, and more importantly, you won't be banging it against your leg as you're walking around with it. Also, I find it's a lot easier to get these things through a doorway if you are carrying it from the base. Now, the next tip is making sure that you never cross your arms over the mitre saw blade path. Now, most mitre saws are made for right-handed people, so I'm sorry if you are a lefty. And what that means is you should often find yourself stood on the left-hand side of the blade, like I am now. And if I wanted to say make my cut here, I would be plunging down the blade into this position with absolutely no risk of my arm being in front of that blade path. However, you do find yourself sometimes, and it tends to be when you're cutting longer pieces of wood, needing to support the piece on that right-hand side. And you might be tempted when doing this to simply do something like this. Do not do this. This is bad. What you're doing is highly increasing your chances of cutting your arm off, and you definitely don't want to cut your arm off. Instead, what you want to do is one of two things. Now, you could get yourself one of the rolling stands like I've got here, and what this allows you to do is push the piece of timber through, and it will provide that support on the right-hand side. So there's absolutely no need for you to reach over that blade path. Secondly, and a cheaper option, is you could simply just ask someone to help you and support the weight on that right-hand side before you make that cut. So remember, never cross your arms whilst using a mitre saw, but definitely cross your cursor over the like button and give it a click. Now, it's no secret that mitre saws are really loud. And if you were to ask a more experienced woodworker what their top tips for using a mitre saw are, well, they might not hear you because they may not have heeded their own advice. And this one is simply wear ear protection. I know any sort of PPE can seem kind of lame when you're doing it for yourself, but it does pay off in dividends later on in life. Grab yourself some of these really cheap ear protectors and bung them in every time you're going to be using loud equipment for any extended length of time. And protect that hearing so you can continue to watch more great advice like this on YouTube. Now, I think you'll struggle to find someone that would argue with the fact that a mitre saw produces the most sawdust out of pretty much any power tool. I mean, just look at this stuff. And even though I work outside most of the time, I definitely do prefer not having to sweep up after myself at the end of the day. So I would always encourage you to set up some basic dust extraction. Not only is this going to keep your work surface looking clean as you make your cuts, it's also going to prevent all of that sawdust becoming airborne and you breathing it in. This is especially important if you are using your mitre saw inside, and if you've ever been using tools like this for a long period of time and noticed that you've got a bit of a tickly feeling at the back of your throat, you'll probably find it's because you didn't have your dust extraction set up. Now, I'm a really big fan of this Evolution dust extractor, mainly because it partners perfectly with my Evolution mitre saw. But if you are looking to save yourself a little bit of money, one neat little trick I have seen people do online is buy themselves a 90-degree elbow and poke it into the ducting where the dust is being extracted. What this allows you to do is point that elbow down towards the floor, which will at least prevent a lot of that sawdust becoming airborne. Now, hands up if you've ever gone to make a cut on a piece of timber and it's been off by the width of a fly's leg. Well, there is a very easy way to make these slight micro adjustments, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So if you look here, I want to cut just a very small fraction of a hair off this. Now, what you want to do in order to make a very small micro adjustment like this is lower your blade down to the lowest it will go and butt your piece of wood up against the edge of that blade. Then lift your blade up, and you'll notice that when you go to push it back down, it is hitting very so slightly. Now, the reason for this is the teeth on the blade are a fraction of a hair thicker than the blade itself. So by resting it on the side of the blade and then lifting it up, you are giving that edge of the blade enough room to take it off. And you can see that that has worked really well. One nice little trick that I learned early on is if you're using timber that has a good side and a bad side, you want to make sure that you're always cutting with your best side facing upwards, and I'll show you why. So you can see here that I have a nice piece of oak flooring. I'm going to say that this top bit here is my good side, and underneath is the bad side. Now, splinters and tear out occur when the blade breaks through the wood, which is the bottom side when plunging a narrow cut like this. So it's always better to cut the narrow bores with the show side face up. I'll show you what I mean. You can see that the top two cuts there have come out really nice. There's absolutely no tear out that I can see. However, if I flip it over, you'll see, albeit not that much, there is a little bit of tear out there that you're dealing with. Now, alternatively, if you're trying to cut down wider boards, the opposite advice is true. And the reason for that is because you're bringing the blade to the front of the piece and pushing it through, the back of the blade is going to be flicking the wood up. And again, I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to say that this is my good side and this is my bad side. And because this is a wider board, I want to put it with the good side facing down. And the reason for this is when I plunge to make that cut, the back of the blade as I'm pushing it through is actually flicking the wood upwards. And I don't know how well you can see that on camera. I have got some tear out going on at the top here, so bear that in mind. And lastly, if you've noticed that your mitre saw isn't giving you that perfect 90-degree cut, then it might be time to check the calibration of your saw. And luckily, this is fairly easy to do. All you're going to need is to get yourself a set square and a few basic tools. Usually a set of Allen keys is all you're going to need. You're going to want to make sure that the blade is square with the base of your mitre saw, and also that the back of the fence is square with the blade as well. There are a bunch of guides online if you're not sure how to calibrate your saw specifically, so make sure to check those out after you're done here. If you've got this Evolution mitre saw, then you can click on the video at the top here somewhere, and that will link you through to how to calibrate this one specifically. Those are just some of the mistakes that I made as a new woodworker with a mitre saw. I recently compared this Evolution battery-powered mitre saw to the Milwaukee, which cost over £150 more. And if you want to see why I chose to keep this one, you can check out that video comparison here next. Until next time, happy building.